Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. The only real estate brokerage that donates 50% of its net commissions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting climate change. Amy, Vance, a pleasure to meet both of you. Let's get a little wild on this podcast. I appreciate you both being here.
Nice to meet you. Happy to be here.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Ethan.
Pleasure to meet both of you. And what we always like to do is get the show started with a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing at the moment. So we will start with Vance on that one.
Sure. Vance Martin. I'm president of the Wild Foundation, and is based here in Boulder. That's our headquarters. We have people here and there. The Wild Foundation is what they call a 501c3, a nonprofit charity organization. We do the nature conservation work. One of our little mottos is protecting through connecting. We like to connect people to nature, wildlife, and we also believe in the connectivity of nature, saving half the world's lands and seas. Nature needs half is our kind of goal. And that's a little bit about me. How I got here is a long story, because that's what happens when you have a few years under your belt. Amy, over to you.
Amy, over to you.
Yeah, Ethan. So I believe in the power of people to change the world. And in one way or another, throughout my entire adult career, I have been working on mobilizing that power and coordinating it for what I believe are actions that will benefit both people and the planet. I came to Wild Foundation at the end of my research phase and studying for my PhD at Colorado State University. And I was then a scholar in social movement theory as well as environmental policy. And when I found the Wild Foundation, which has been building a global social movement around keeping Earth wild for more than 40 years now, it just seemed like the perfect fit, and it was. And so I've been here for almost 7 years.
Well, that's incredible. And I'm curious how you became so committed to nature conservation. What's like your origin story before university or schooling?
Well, I mean, we all have, the camping stories and the encounters with wildlife and whatnot. But I think that my commitment to conservation is actually as much as I feel a deep and abiding connection with the natural world, and there's no place I feel more at home in than a wild area. But my commitment to conservation really stems from my commitment to excellence. I don't believe so much in good guys and bad guys, but I do believe that mediocrity is the enemy. And too often we make these compromises with ourselves because, I don't know, we're trying to be realistic, we're trying to be practical, and we know what excellence is, and we can kind of sense what it would feel like to live in like the ideal world, but we tell ourselves it's never in our reach. And nowhere have I seen braver and more necessary visionaries than in the conservation field that's saying, look, we have this vital civilization that we need to maintain, but we actually can't maintain it unless we also keep Earth wild, because wilderness is the foundation of not just civilization, but all of life, our lives included. And so I think it's their commitment that inspired me, as well as the excellence of their vision, even in the face of a lot of uncertainty, criticism, and doubt.
Amy, that was beautiful. And I love that. And I don't really think that we're ever really separate from the wild. We create these plastic walls. I talk about being in these little boxes, but in reality, humans are wild. There's living things all around us, and like we have these we put on these blinders and we think we're our safe little spaces, but they're just constructs, and we're still in this wild, vast universe. If anything, before we kind of get into talking about the benefits of rewilding the planet, I did want to pass it back to Vance briefly, because he has obviously, of course, you guys are both with the same organization. He had this quote that he said in a video from what must have been like a decade or two ago, where if you want to do something and someone tells you it's possible, you're on the right track. I think that's an amazing quote. I love that. I'm curious how you came to that like perspective to begin with.
Well, thank you for asking the question, Ethan. It sort of brings to mind one of my guiding principles, and that is, if you want to achieve something that you've never had before, then you have to do something you've never done. So life is, if you want to make an impact, and in my mind, why else are we here? Yes, we're here to have a good time, to raise a good family, to pay the bills and all that. I've had a lifetime of that. I have children and grandchildren and all that kind of stuff. But beyond that, stepping out beyond ourselves, we're in a world that needs help. People need help. Nature needs help. Not that it will survive if we don't help it. It will survive. We won't.
Right.
So my reaching beyond in order to do something that has impact. Most people don't think that way. And I'm not saying I'm any bit better or worse or anything like that. It's not an ego statement. It's just saying the reality is most people define their parameters and spend most of their life not asking the questions of how do you go beyond those parameters in order to discover what's there. So most people, especially as you get a little bit older, and that's where I am in my life. I have gained life experience, as they say, instead of AGE. But as you get a little bit older, I've watched it. People tend to narrow their horizons and to define their life by what they can't do. Oh, that's not possible. So that's a red flag to me, boy. It means get stuck in there, because if somebody says you can't do something, there's something in there to be done.
Certainly. I'm a big believer in the idea that anything is possible. And we're going to get into talking about reserving 50% of the planet to be wild spaces. And that seems like, in my mind, I'm thinking about literally limitless possibilities. Humans can do anything. We can break the rules of gravity and stuff. I'm sure physicists would get after me because of that. Let's pass it back to Amy for now to stay on track to kind of explain what the benefits wild spaces offer to humanity in particular.
Well, so let's just go back to basics, right? Humanity was born in wilderness. When we talk about Mother Earth, we're talking about the wilderness. And just to preface all of this, Vance said, if you want to do something you've never done before, or if you want to have something you've never done before, you have to do something you've never done before. Well, actually, the flip side of that is that we are about ready to do something that's never been done before on this planet in a negative sense. For 500 million years, more than that, we've had this protective biosphere that has supported life, and that's covered the planet, right? We are at this precipice where we have less wilderness, we have less nature than we've ever had. And we don't know what life looks like. I mean, science can give us some guesses, but we don't know what life looks like after that. So there is that kind of existential question. But more than that, our identity comes from the wilderness. The human spirit was born in the wilderness. The things that we admire most about ourselves, our ingenuity, our adaptability, our ability to work together in groups and solve problems, all of these things we inherited from the prey that we hunted and the predators that hunted us. These qualities came from wilderness. So when we remove wild nature from the surface of the earth, not only are we jeopardizing our survival, but we're jeopardizing who we are and the memory of who we are. And maybe, and I don't think this is possible, and I think it would be kind of ridiculous to do this anyway. We could engineer the life support services that we need, and we don't have that capacity now, but theoretically, maybe we could engineer these life support services and live on an entirely urban planet with no wild spaces whatsoever, just a park and a garden and a zoo here and there. But who would want that? Who would want to live in a place where there's nothing undiscovered and there's nothing unknown and there's no corner of the world where there might be dragons, So there's more to this question than just our survival. It's a question of identity and who we want to be as a people, and we can make that choice right now. Right now, we're kind of unconsciously making that choice. The Wild Foundation is kind of trying to push that choice into a more conscious level where we think about, okay, so I don't just have to go down this path of destroying everything. There's an option of preserving it. Now, how do we do this?
Right. So, I mean, I think we're obviously making a choice one way or the other. So the question is, what is the best choice we can be possibly making? Well, at this point, I want to pass it back to Vance for a second to talk about the kind of the history of Wild Foundation and some of the biggest projects that you're currently undertaking over there.
Yeah, good. Thanks for that. Look, I totally subscribe to everything that Amy's just said. I have a deeply philosophical, value-driven side to myself. That's what we think Wild is based on. Amy has the same. And we're a practical conservation organization. How do you take all of this philosophical and real concept that we are wild creatures, our DNA is wild, take a look into your gut if you want to see something really wild, right?
Yeah.
So, we're wild creatures who have forgotten that through our pride, through our intellect. We've gone beyond ourselves a little bit. I had a friend whose mother had a very dry wit. And when he graduated from the Virginia Military Academy, he came up to her all full of himself and waved his diploma. And she looked at him and dryly said, "Well, I can see that you're now educated beyond yourself." And we're a practical conservation organization. We actually started in Africa by a very world famous conservationist named Ian Player and Makubu Ntombela, who was a Zulu elder of the old tradition. He was of the oral tradition. He didn't read or write. He was Ian Player's companion in the wilderness as they saved the white rhino and did lots of things over the years. I met Ian. We began to work together a long time ago. He became my mentor. He convinced me to move back to the States. I was living abroad for many years, and I gave a 4-year commitment in 1980. And here we are, still at it. So our conservation work, I love the expression, you have to kick the tires on something. If you're going to buy a car, you walk around and you kick the tires and you have a look at it. Well, a conservation organization needs to have on the ground success in whatever it chooses to do, whether it's strictly speaking wildlife conservation, which we do. Our biggest project is in West Africa, in the war zone that is the nation called Mali. And there's a herd of desert adapted elephants living in the Sahel. And we work with the local people to empower them to have on what's called community-led conservation. We work from top of government to community level, but it's the local people who get the benefits. It's very complicated, but it's very, in the end, straightforward. If people benefit from wild nature, they will save it. They will learn to love it. And when you love something, you're going to save it. So that's one of our big projects. We're also working in the Amazon with at least one tribe and helping them secure and protect their rainforest lands. We have a global youth network called Coalition Wild. Historically, every 4 or 5 years, we did something called the World Wilderness Congress. We haven't done one in a couple of years. We had to cancel the last one in March of 2020. Gee, I wonder why. So we do a whole range of things. And again, all under this banner of nature needs half, because science tells us that, at least half the Earth's lands and seas need to be intact and functional so it can provide the life support, right? It's called, the jargon is ecological services. I just call it life support, because without it, life cannot either survive or evolve.
Yeah, it's interesting that even trying to talk about conserving half is very, very difficult to achieve. It's like only half of the world to like be allowed to flourish and have plenty of life. I will pass this next question to either of you. I'm curious what one of your thoughts is on the distinction between conservation and ecological restoration, which kind of has unlimited growth potential versus saving what already exists.
The usual dynamic or the question is, what's the difference between conservation and preservation? Conservation is an active field of protecting enough nature so that it can remain intact and functioning. You mentioned ecological restoration. That is an aspect of conservation, because you are restoring a damaged landscape so that it returns to a state of functionality. And I'll make a distinction here. What's the difference between ecological restoration and rewilding? Rewilding is a type of restoration, but it has a different goal. Ecological restoration is normally, you see that field out there that's been hammered for decades, and it doesn't have any topsoil and there's no trees. Well, let's get it back in shape so we can grow good food for us, and it's a nice, healthy, and that's ecological restoration. And there's many different types of it. Rewilding is, gee, I wonder what that big field or that valley used to look like, and how did it function before it was logged or otherwise impacted by human beings. Let's try to create the ecological conditions where nature self-heals and then continues to evolve in the way that nature wants to, not just to serve us. So rewilding is part of ecological restoration, but ecological restoration as practiced is not always rewilding. There we go, Amy. Yeah, sorry.
So there's another aspect here I want to touch on, and that's kind of the traditional way that conservation has been viewed versus what many conservation groups are actually doing now. And there's this concept called fortress conservation, where it's basically like we're gonna put a fence around this land, and no one's gonna go inside of it, and that land is going to exist for the tigers or the monkeys or whatever kind of exotic and threatened species lives there. And that's not what the Wild Foundation does, nor is it what many conservation groups do nowadays. What we're really looking for is to restore the ecological or preserve the ecological integrity of the land to ensure that it's interconnected so that there's genetic flow, there's elemental flow, and that there's no industrial extraction or permanent industrial infrastructure in those places. In fact, some of the best, highest quality wildlands in the world is also occupied by human populations, indigenous groups. While indigenous people only make up 5% of Earth's population, they steward 40% of the remaining wildlands and 80% of our biodiversity. And they do this while there are many contemporary indigenous scientists. They've done this largely through unscientific processes, cultural processes, because their cultures are conservation. And so I just want to make that distinction that when we say we want to protect half the planet, we're not saying turn half the planet into Yellowstone National Park. We're essentially saying, that there's different types of protected areas, and certainly that's a cornerstone of this effort. But we are also working with communities around the world to ensure the integrity of the landscapes around them.
And thank you for doing that. But what I was gonna say, it's a hard sell rewilding when it doesn't demonstrably benefit people, because humans are so concerned with their own mechanism, or like the societies that we've created. We're so focused, we're not thinking about the mycelium network that's floating around in the space behind us, or the insects in the ground. So I just think it's really hard to get that, especially when I'm always talking about how to use economics to fight climate change. It seems like rewilding would be a really tough sell. So I wanted to ask, I suppose, again, either of you, what advice do you give to someone who sees themselves as separate or superior or above nature?
Well, can I just jump in here really
Yes,
quickly?
please do.
Because Vance will tell you at some point in this interview that he's a conservationist, yes, but he's also a relationship counselor. And if we imagine our relationship with nature like we do any of our other relationships, a relationship with a romantic partner, for example. Inside of that relationship, no matter how healthy and intimate it is, each of those people needs space for themselves. We can think of this as guys or girls' night out, right? If you don't have a space for yourself, you're not healthy. You can't explore a part of yourself. And I like to think of setting aside places where ecological processes, wild processes, have primacy in the same way that I do when we set aside space for our partner in our relationship. By allowing them to have space, they're healthier and our relationship is healthier as well.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
Now, I'll just spin off from that to say that the other part of relationship is engagement. And it's consciously knowing, sensing, wanting to know what your partner needs. That could be a business partner, as Amy said, a romantic partner, can be a good friend. If you rip off your partner, what's going to happen? Dysfunction, at best, dysfunction. So, as well as understanding that your partner needs some space for itself, so give nature some room on land and sea so she can do her thing, but also engage and understand that the life support that is created is essential to our life on Earth. Therefore, we are in an essential relationship, people and nature. And most people don't realize it because of this paradigm of it's just like a big piggy bank, or going to a shopping mall and take whatever you want. Well, I think a lot of people are waking up to know that's a fast way to not only dysfunction but to ruin. So when I say to people, when I meet people who think they're king or queen of the world and they don't need nature, I just ask them some very basic questions. Tell me about how you want to breathe, clean water. I mean, these kind of simple questions. I don't normally challenge people, nor do I try to change their minds unless they want to engage me. I find trying to change people's mind who don't want to engage me to be an exercise in futility, and I would much rather do something else rather than feel a high degree of lack of appreciation.
Those are wise words, and I'm glad to have learned that lesson in my teens rather than later on in life. That's why I love this show, just hearing people's perspectives. I don't try to push any sort of objective. Of course, I'll ask clarifying questions, but yeah. And then as far as that breakup analogy, I had never heard that. Like, if you are ripping off your partner consistently, you might break up and then they'll just move on to live without you. And in which case, if nature does that, we all don't exist anymore. But I do want to get into talking about this half of all land on Earth? So just basically, how much nature do we need to be in balance, and where is this campaign for half coming from?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No,
Vance,
go ahead.
please. Well, can I take it from like the 1970s, and then you can take it from 2009. So back in the 1970s, a couple of scientists, the Odoms, were researching wetlands in Florida. And what they started to observe is that once more than approximately half of a landscape was degraded, the ecological functionality of that landscape, the life support services of the landscape, they weren't reduced by half. They would precipitously just kind of fall off. And what we call this, right, is a tipping point. Mm-hmm. That we cross these thresholds and then there's a precipitous loss of the ecological services. And as time went by, more and more research began to come to light to show that this applied not just at a landscape by landscape level, but it applies at a planetary level. So while there's some landscapes like rainforests that require a lot more than half, they require 80% before they reach their threshold. Approximately across all landscapes, we're looking at about 50%. So that's where this idea came from in terms of contemporary science. Now, there's another side to the story with indigenous leaders, their observations, their vision, and I think Vance should get into that.
Well, yeah, the science on this is increasingly clear. And why is it increasingly clear? Is because of the technological ability that has blossomed since late 70s, 1980 on remote sensing, viewing the Earth, assessing where we are. When I was a young boy, you couldn't do these kind of things, So now we actually can assess the systems a lot more. The thing about our indigenous brothers and sisters is that it's not about science. It's about what's the right thing to do. The right thing to do is to share the earth with each other and to share with nature. Nature provides for us. We must provide for her. So it's a very simple, values-based, culturally based reality. And one of our contentions at the Wild Foundation is that science and economics and policy, all of which we work with extensively, are all very important. And these are the tools that will help us make decisions. But that's the key word. These are tools. What's the hand that holds the tools? It's human culture. So to be a successful, efficiently long-term conservationist or anything, you need to know the culture that you're working with. If you're in a business deal, you sell houses. Sorry, real estate. Pardon me. What do you do half the time? You're assessing the potential buyer. Who are they? what do they really need? What kind of house do they really need? Are they really viewing this thing correctly? So you're automatically in relationship. You have a culture that creates a relationship, right? And if it's going to be successful, you don't want to rip the other person off. It's nice to make some money. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's culture, and we extend that to some of the traditional arts and humanities. So you'll see a lot of our projects have storytelling, have the arts, photography, books, writing, a lot of things like that, because that is who we are. Culture informs us who we are. And what better place to be in order to be effective and to survive than to know who you are?
Definitely. And I know who I am as the guy who gives away half of his money to organizations that work on environmental issues. I don't know how we can get people to agree to do something like this, to give away half of our spaces people love, doing their fishing. And, we're in this phase right now where we're sucking all the resources out and consuming it so we can live in these big, lavish lifestyles. I mean, for example, in Boulder, we can't even agree how many people can live in a single house. There was a huge debate over the zoning laws. So how can we get humanity, beyond just talking about climate change, to actually agree on protecting half of our wild spaces?
Well,
I don't know.
It's a good, honest podcast response. I like it.
I don't know. It's never been done before. But I have some hypotheses because of my background, and we're working on that. But with Boulder, I want to get back to Boulder really quickly. Over 60% of Boulder is protected.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, Boulder's doing something right there. And it also shows that you can have a high quality of life, a high standard of life, and support nature around you as well. But there's another aspect of this too, is that on a planetary level, we still have 50%, about, maybe a little under right now, but 50% of the planet left that's intact. So it's still there. It's not protected yet. We haven't set it aside to say this has to stay intact. But right now, 50% of nature, land and sea, is functioning more or less correctly. And so we have this opportunity right now, because we know 50% is as essential as keeping the temperature under 1.5 degrees, right? So we have this opportunity right now where it's like, we have the nature here. We can set it aside. This is economically, politically, and ecologically going to be the most efficient way to do this. And then we can innovate based on that kind of necessary limitation. We can innovate the processes and the technology we need to continue to improve our civilization. But we're also on the precipice of something really dangerous, right? Because in the next 25 years, we're going to add 25 million kilometers of road to the planet. We're going to double the amount of urban square footage. 25 years from now, there's going to be a lot less nature left. And our need for it isn't going to be less, but it's going to be less. And the question is, when is it more efficient to protect nature? When we have it, or when we have to restore, including extinct species, on an unimaginable scale?
Do you think we can have green, mixed spaces where cities have, I've seen these pictures of animals crossing over roads on these green bridges. Can we do stuff like that? And can that count for part of it as well?
Yes and no. Vance should take this, but I mean, we really do need intact spaces. That being said, there's some really interesting research out there, some really good stuff, especially from the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, where they're saying that in order to get to half, we're going to have a lot of corridors.
Yeah.
That basically connect wild spaces between each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically the reality of where we're at right now. But Vance can speak to this more.
That's fine with me. I just wanted to revert to one thing to say, how do we do this when you can't get the Boulder City Council to agree how many people in a house?
Yeah.
Well, you want a lesson in self-harm, go to some of these major UN climate change talks and biodiversity talks, as they, they're exact. They're a demonstration of exactly what you said. Looks impossible, Now, I bring it down to a very simple level, and I want to congratulate you, because what do you do in your own life? You're not a professional conservationist. My experience is that most successful conservation awareness of nature is done by non-professionals. It's done by, like what you're doing. You meet people that are doing it. You dedicate part of your life to it, whether it's through awareness, through a podcast, or through money. Maybe you're a person with a ranch. Well, figure out how to run that ranch right. Maybe it's a working ranch, but I tell you, there are ranches I've been on that are called working wilderness, and boy, some of them are outstanding. So do what you can do. The most important thing is, hello, wake up. Time to do something.
Yeah.
Well, and one thing too, I did say I don't know, and I don't know how we're exactly the roadmap to get to where we want to go. That being said, Wild has taken some steps in that direction, as has other institutions. And so 12 years ago, when Wild was the first global NGO to publicly declare that we need to protect half, and we launched the Nature Needs Half Network and Coalition at that time, there were just, high-level conservationists from really top-level conservation groups that were emailing us and saying that, of course, privately, I know that this needs to be done, but publicly, I would never say that, because I would be laughed in my face, and you will be too. And that speaks to that, the idea that there's just some things that are right, but they're impossible, so we shouldn't even try. Well, in 12 years' time, we've come a long way. And last September in Marseille, France, at the last World Conservation Congress, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature holds these congresses every year, and they basically set the agenda to advise United Nations processes on conservation. At this Congress, we had a very ambitious and controversial proposal that essentially called on the IUCN to recognize the scientific necessity of protecting half, and to set 30% by 2030 as a milestone. And there was, a bit of an uproar about this, but with utilizing the relationships that Wild has cultivated for 50 years, and just a great coalition of partners, we were able to secure over 98% of the NGO vote in favor of this motion, and I think it was over 86% of the government member vote. And so what 12 years ago was an impossible idea took one big step to becoming a reality at the IUCN last September.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think the 30 by 30, which is what you're referring to, is gaining a lot of traction as well, and I think that's a great way to go. And then the 50 by 50 would be next. Sounds good to me. I just, I'm willing to keep pushing on it. But of course, I mentioned before, as you said, I'm not a career conservationist, but, I don't even know what people would call me at this point. But I am very interested in businesses. So I was wondering what your perspective, either of your perspective, was on the nonprofit sector and governments working on conservation versus the for-profit sector, specifically having missions that are dedicated to assisting in these challenges.
I think it's, I started off life as a private sector business person when I was real young. I had several small businesses. I'm a great believer in the private sector. In fact, I believe that the private sector is much more likely to lead the way to answers than is the public sector, because the public sector, by definition, is very bureaucratic and slow to change. Very self-aware of protecting its own rear end. That's what a lot of it's about. Nonprofits have a role to play. I think sometimes it's a little bit more important to stress what can the private sector do, because the private sector, if they want to stay in business, and staying in business means continuing to earn money, and increasingly the limits or the path ahead to continuing to have a successful business depends on an environment that is stable, that you know what to expect, so you can make plans for a business. What's happening right now is the very beginnings of a very unstable system. Okay, we're all seeing it. I don't want to cite the examples; they're all quite obvious. The thing it's sort of comforting thing and discomforting thing, depending where you're coming from, is that nature is not emotional. We may be emotional about nature. I know I am, but nature is not emotional. Nature has consequences, and what we're running up against now are the consequences of our actions.
Definitely.
And so business people see this a lot sooner than most people, because they have to look into the future. So there's more change in the private sector now. Look, there's a lot of bad actors in the private sector, and there's a lot more awakened people in the private sector now than there was just 10 years ago, because the handwriting's on the wall.
Definitely. And if you go scroll back through the past episodes in this podcast, you can see so many people getting engaged, which is what gives me continuous hope and optimism. So I hope to spread that to as many people as possible. Continuing on the trend of optimism, for someone who's listening to this, who does want to get involved and is very interested in having a positive impact, what have we seen historically as most effective actions people can take to actually achieve these changes or reach these goals that we're trying to get to?
Oh, Amy, that's your kind of question there.
I think it's yours. I mean, I'll take a stab at it, but look, over 80% of extinction is driven by habitat loss, and most of that habitat loss happens under completely legal conditions. It's, permits granted by governments and municipalities. In order to actually halt the drivers of both extinction and the component of climate change that is being exacerbated by the loss of nature, because nature and climate is one system, they're not separate. We have to work together as communities to adapt our values and our actions and the laws that bind us. And so as interesting as on the ground local conservation projects are, and certainly Wild has many of these that we're very proud of, and there's just some fabulous ones where people are to great personal risk are saving nature and are saving species. Those things are what our founder, Ian Player, called rear guard actions. They're defensive actions where we're basically trying to make little outposts of healthy wild nature so that there's something left to protect in the future. But we have to become much more offensive about this. We have to become much more proactive. And in order to do that, we have to work together in our communities and across our communities to change laws and to change the expectations about how we relate to nature.
Amy, how do you stay motivated in times of hopelessness?
It's I don't believe in hopelessness, honestly. Like it's just not an option for me. And I guess I'm lucky in that regard. I know that many people struggle with this, but I am, my background's in the social sciences and political science. And the great kind of philosophical root of the social sciences is this idea of agency and structure, or free will and determinism. And I know that there's a lot of people now that are questioning the idea of agency and are questioning the idea of free will. There's so much of our biology, so many of our actions that are driven by context, by biology, things like that. But the fact of the matter is that change happens, that humans drive change. We're a different civilization than we were 10,000 years ago. We're a different civilization than we were 100 years ago. 100 years ago, women couldn't vote. Black people couldn't vote. The equality was less than it was. It's not perfect now, but it's changed. And it's changed because agency exists, because we have the power to change the course of history. And I certainly have not I have not confronted some of the challenges that other people have that have been able to have a really positive impact on the world. And so when I start to feel a little bit sorry for myself, or things are a little bit too hard, I have so many inspirational role models, many of them around me at the Wild Foundation and within conservation, to keep me going and to keep me inspired.
That's great. Yeah, it's all about being involved in a good community. Community is so essential. And I can't help but poke into the agency and free will thing a little bit, because I am a philosophy minor. That was like my favorite classes in school. And I was definitely very into like hard determinism, meaning that you don't have free will. Free will doesn't exist. Everything is cause and effect. ABC is what led you to today. But I think the tendency to lean that way decreases when you see something beyond yourself, whether you are religious or you believe in the powers of the universe. You can see it can be very scary and there's too much stuff. But when you go out and you make choices and you try to help people, for example, you can see the direct impact of your choices in their inflections in their faces. And I don't know. I think that's really, and then watching The Matrix and stuff makes that.
Well,
what were we going to say?
As a philosophy minor, was that?
Yeah. Well, I'm a philosopher generally. I would say,
as a philosopher then that deals with agency and structure, and as an falling on the determinism side, there, I'm sure somebody has asked you, well, when you cross the street, do you look both ways?
I'll say, if my mom's listening, yeah.
And I mean, even the most deterministic of us, we look both ways.
Yeah.
And agency falls on a spectrum, and I agree with the determinists in that true agency is rare, but it's also powerful, and it's not always limited. There are moments in our lives, there are crossroads in our lives, when sometimes it may not feel like it's big, but sometimes our choices will reverberate, and they'll reverberate throughout history. And we may never even know the impact we really had, but it's there, and we can see that in those who came before us. And at some point in time, we will be those that came before others. And so our choices matter for those people.
Yes, they do. I have other thoughts, but I'm not going to add on that because that was just too beautiful. To conclude the podcast, Vance, I would just love to hear any advice you have for young people who are passionate about building a better world.
Sure. Thanks, Ethan. I started with a comment on a saying that means a lot to me about doing something you've never done. It's just two thoughts to end off my little bit here. One is, you can be a leader. You can go out there. You can mobilize people. You can do things. But humility is a key factor. To be humbled in the face of powers greater than us, and nature is a power that's greater than us, I think is very important. And extending that humility as a sign of respect to other people by listening, by forming those relationships. I think that's really important. For those of us who are U2 fans, they have this song, Mysterious Ways, right? And to me, life is a bit mysterious. Nature certainly is. We think we know a lot about it, and then we learn a lot more. But there's this wonderful couple of lyrics from Mysterious Ways. To touch is to heal, to hurt is to steal. If you want to kiss the sky, you'd better learn how to kneel. And then he says, on your knees, boy. That makes a lot of sense to me. Final thing I'll say is there's a lot of bad news around. I too do not believe in hopelessness because that means death. That said, there's a lot of bad news. We've got a lot of work to do. We can do it. What do? On those days? I tell you, I turn the news off. That's for damn sure. Because I'm a bit of a news junkie. And after a while, I say, no, that's enough because it's just ruining my head. But the other thing is something that I think of every morning, every evening. I mean, a constant thought is that, man, this is an exciting time. As Amy said, we have a chance here to make big change. And how exciting is that? As far as I'm concerned, we were born for this moment. We're privileged to be here to try to create the change that is needed right now.
I love that. That was fantastic. Let's rise up to the occasion, all of us. Thank you so much, sure. Both of you, Vance, Amy. I appreciate you taking some time to come on. I love what y'all are doing. I'm all good. Did you have either of you have anything to add before we kind of sign off here? Nope. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have both of you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ethan. Stay well now.
Thank you, Ethan.
So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrboulder.com today.